Buenas tardes a todos ustedes. Muchas gracias por venir hoy a la Casa Árabe. Tengo el gusto de presentar hoy la conferencia El arte sagrado de la caligrafía cúfica, una reflexión estética.
Calligraphy, an aesthetic reflection. This paper will be given by Professor Valérie González. It is a paper, part of a program of activities developed in October in Casa Árabe. Activities focused on highlighting the aesthetic value of Arabic calligraphy in all its varieties in the past and in the present. Today we're going to discuss this issue from a historical and artistic point of view, and we'll study how significant Kufic calligraphy is in terms of aesthetics, especially in the 10th and 11th centuries. On October the 28th, we'll have the opportunity to listen to the Lebanese designer Pascal Zombi, who will discuss the issue of calligraphy from a more contemporary point of view. He will discuss new typographies developed in Arabic from the point of view of graphic design. Today we have the pleasure of having with us an expert in aesthetic and Islamic visual culture. She has a PhD in art history and Islamic civilization by the University of Marseille. She has a degree as well in Arabic studies, and she holds a master's degree in fine arts by the School of Fine Arts and Architecture at Marseille Lumini. We can mention among her works Insights on Islamic Aesthetics, Visual Culture and History, Sarajevo 2006, as well as Beauty and Islam, Aesthetics of Islamic Art and Architecture, published in 2006. Currently, she is the head coordinator of a series of papers on Islamic studies at the Leighton House Museum in London. Well, I'm not going to elaborate on that. Without further ado, I will give her the floor. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much for coming, to all of you, and thank you very much for inviting me tonight. I'm very happy, very pleased, and very honored to talk today in the Casa Árabe. I'm just a little bit ashamed not to speak in Spanish, so I will have to speak slowly because you will get the Spanish translation, and I thank in advance the person who is dealing with this tough job of translating what I will say in Spanish. So today I will present an aesthetic reflection on the art of calligraphy, and specifically Kufic calligraphy, which is the first canonized form of calligraphy in the history of Islamic calligraphy. So it's not the first type of writing, the first script, but it's the first form of writing in an artistic form in history. So it has a specific aura, a specific symbol in the art of calligraphy, Kufic, the Kufic script. And you have here an example in this first document of a Quranic page written in the first Kufic form. And you can see that the Kufic is characterized by its very minimalist geometry, which is based on a very straight baseline. So it has this geometric characteristic, and it is really the first form of writing that was canonized, turned into a practice with very strict rules of practice. So I will not talk about the history of Kufic calligraphy, but instead give you my reflection, my critical aesthetic view and understanding of the art of calligraphy. And because Kufic calligraphy is an art form that reflects Islam as a faith and as a culture. So I will premise my discussion first of all, and you will see that when we talk about aesthetics, we always have to go back to very simple things, to make very simple statements in order to reach the essence of things. So sometimes it might seem simple what I'm saying, but actually it's very important to pay attention to these simple facts And one fact which is important here is to distinguish between calligraphy, writing, and epigraphy. Epigraphy is not calligraphy. Epigraphy is a form of writing which is basically informative. So you find indeed epigraphy in artistic media, like for example, Roman epigraphy, Latin epigraphy, and Roman art. But this is not calligraphy. This is informative writing. One has to distinguish between calligraphy and epigraphy. It's extremely important, even though art historians very often confuse the two terms. What is specific to calligraphy? Calligraphy is an artistic complexity. It belongs to both the material world of forms and the immaterial world of thought and language. So calligraphy produces meaning through the intersection between discourse and visuality. And visuality is by no means secondary to discourse. On the contrary, it's a play between the two. And very often you have what is called a phenomenon of hyperdialectics between visuality and discourse with calligraphy. So calligraphy is an artistic complexity versus epigraphy is a linguistic tool. So it's much more difficult to deal with calligraphy, particularly when we can observe that in Islam, calligraphy appears in all sorts of media. Everywhere you have calligraphy, which raises the question, why do we have calligraphy everywhere in the Islamic world? So the first question, how did calligraphy gain this extraordinary importance? So first of all, here I show you among the earliest documents that are available. They show something which is very important in Islam and that somebody has to have all the time, that everyone has to have in mind, is that writing is associated, first of all, in Islam with this sacred gesture of copying the Qur'an. Because copying the Qur'an is the way to fix God's speech in the material world, in the phenomenal world. Writing and calligraphy in Islam are metaphysical mirrors. They are metaphysical tools as well. Why? Because Islam is a logocentric culture. And it all goes back to what is Islam about. In Islam, there is one principle, again, one of these essences, one of these very simple statements that are of utter importance, is that in Islam, God is known and knowable only through speech, through language, logos, in the purest sense. If we compare, for example, with Christianity, you have Jesus, which is the logos, incarnated logos. In Islam, there is no incarnation of the logos in any body of flesh and blood. But incarnation, yes, meaning a material form that expresses the logos as a form of faith, as religion. Letters, writing. Writing is a form. Letters are bodies, but they are bodies without flesh and blood. They are bodies, like the speech, the voice, the sounds. These are forms, material forms, sensible forms. They are bodies, but with no blood and flesh. So we are dealing with a logocentrism, which is a Derrida concept. I will not explain it philosophically, but it means that we are dealing with the logos in the purest sense, because God is only knowable and known through his message that was, from the Islamic viewpoint, delivered to the world of man, of mankind, through messages in different temporalities, beginning with Abraham and all the genealogy of the prophets before Muhammad, and then the last revelation was delivered to Muhammad. From the Islamic viewpoint, these are signs, ayat, given to mankind by God. And this is the speech. These ayats are the means of communication between the divine and the world of men. So we are really dealing here with an essential principle, which is logocentrism. Therefore, writing, and I'm not talking about yet an artistic expression, but writing is a metaphysical gesture in Islam. Now, calligraphy, meaning beautiful writing, a practice of writing that becomes aesthetics, that involves visuality, that involves visual perception, that involves visual cognition, is a corollary of writing, but in the world of artistic creation. So how to understand logocentrism in Islam, and then to understand the importance of writing, and then to understand writing turned into an aesthetic gesture, sacred aesthetic gesture? Well, I found here a source that a Sufi poet who, with poetic words, explains what is logocentrism as a principle, as a metaphysical principle. He explains it with poetry. And he explains what I just said, that God is known and only knowable through speech and language. And I read, "Beloved, may I sing the song of your beauty on these pages with words that are yours and not mine. To measure you by human imagination is to try to catch air in a bird cage or water in a fish net. Whatever human cleverness might assume of you, you are not that, and that's all I know. From you comes nothing but blessings. Duality runs the workshop that it displays," and so on and so forth. So this impossibility to know the divine except through his ayats, through language, through his speech. Now, Kufic calligraphy was the first manifestation of writing turned into an artistic gesture, sacred, because the first medium, the first place where calligraphy was practiced was the book, the sacred, the holy book of the Qur'an in Kufic calligraphy. And the most beautiful pages, when Kufic calligraphy reached the peak of its visuality is in the 10th century, in the Abbasid period, with these extraordinary Quranic pages and folios, as you can see. So here, when you look at these pages, I ask you to look. First of all, obviously, anybody can be caught by the utter beauty of the Kufic script without even knowing what is the content, just knowing that it's a Quran. So associating the beautiful visuality with the sacredness of the object, the physical object, a Quranic folio. So this would be the viewpoint of somebody who doesn't know the Quran or anything. But it's very important to understand that this process of being rapturously caught by the beauty of Kufic calligraphy is also at work. When a Muslim that knows the Quran by heart or hear it every day also look at these pages, the same thing is happening, that even before reading, before knowing the content of this calligraphy, is caught by its powerful visuality. So you have here what I call the mystic of calligraphy as a means of elevating the beholder through the power of opticality, visuality, even before knowing the content, the discourse, which is the holiest discourse. It's Quranic. It's the Quranic message. So here now we understand that we are dealing here with the Quran, but with Kufic calligraphy being sacred, being holy, representing this extremely, this key gesture of copying the Quran gave this phenomenon, sacred, religious, mystic, gave the Kufic script an extraordinary power. It posited calligraphy as the ultimate art form in Islam. And from there, we have a development. We can trace a development of artistic expression in Islam, whereby Kufic calligraphy appears in all sorts of media, religious media, secular, profane, of all sorts of media with different functions and not necessarily devotional objects or religious objects. So, for example, here you have an example in the early modern period of copying an important Iranian text with this beautiful Kufic calligraphy. So, of course, from the viewpoint of somebody who doesn't know the language and the content, you can see the visual similarities between a Quranic page and here a page with poetry, essentially. This means that Kufic calligraphy has this very important function in Islam, which is the dhikr function. And this is a very important principle in Islamic culture and in Islamic art, this function of dhikr. Dhikr means remembrance. Dhikr also is known as a Sufi practice. In Sufi gatherings, people remember the name of God. But dhikr, the terms mean, by essence, remembrance. For example, dhikr in the Qur'an means also remember the past revelations of God in the Qur'an. Remember the Torah, remember the Bible. Dhikr means also it signifies all the past prophetic narrations. Dhikr is a polysemic word in Islamic faith, in the Qur'an, but it also has a function in the life of Muslims through the zikr, Sufi practice, but it also has a function in visual forms, in art, the function of remembrance. Kufic calligraphy is a visual dhikr. When you look at Kufic calligraphy, here you have a poetry, Iranian story, but the Kufic, the form, produces this phenomenon of intertextuality, intervisuality, whereby dhikr is activated. You remember Quranic pages. You remember Abbasid Quranic folios or books in the early modern period in an Iranian context here. So you have Kufic calligraphy is a dhikr that activates intervisuality and intertextuality, so that through the Kufic calligraphy, the visualizing of this calligraphy, the remembrance is activated, and remembering what? The pious gesture of copying the Quran. But we are here we are not dealing with a devotional object, we are not dealing with a sacred object. Nevertheless, only the presence of Kufic calligraphy functioning as dhikr makes that this object has a spiritual, faith-related dimension. Now let's continue and let's explore and let's see different manifestations of Kufic dhikr, let's say. Well, here we are dealing with, again, back to a religious context. This brings me to point out something extremely important, is that when we consider Islamic art, we must forget about this clear-cut divide between the religious and the secular, the profane and the sacred, whereby you have categories, and this is very Western, category of religious art and secular art, and you can point out directly, oh, this is religious, this is not. In Islam, it doesn't work like that. And the dhikr function is there just to show you how complicated it is to interpret Islamic art and to categorize it. So here it's clear we are in the famous Mosque of Cordoba, the mihrab of Al-Hakam with the magnificent cupola with this Kufic calligraphy at the basis of the dome. That, of course, is a dhikr again, but a particular historical dhikr through its visuality, that it's in its form here, and its location at the basis of a dome recalls the Kufic calligraphy in mosaics in the Dome of the Rock, in the Haram al-Sharif. Now, Kufic calligraphy. And I'm traveling through time here, medieval times and then early modern, up to contemporary period. I mean, we can travel through time. So this is Iranian architecture, and some of these constructions are not necessarily minarets. They were interpreted as minarets, but with the research, with the development of research, we came to understand that not all these towers, magnificent towers, were minarets actually, or functioning as part of religious compounds, not necessarily. However, they do display Kufic calligraphy, and they do display religious messages, but the medium is not necessarily religious. Here, a very important piece here, Iranian ceramic mihrab, with different calligraphic styles put together to form this masterpiece. And here, Kufic calligraphy is put side by side with more curvy linear styles. Here, in the more early modern period, the use of Kufic calligraphy to produce geometrical shapes that render the legibility of the linguistic content of calligraphy very difficult sometimes, even though it's clear for the viewers that we are dealing with holy names, like Allah here. We can see it here somehow. But sometimes calligraphy is so manipulated visually that the legibility is very difficult. Calligraphy on different media, on pragmatic media, on ordinary objects, the most ordinary objects, or the most elevated objects, from Qur'an to coins to architectural decoration, like on this topographic scroll, on these coins, where you have a discourse. Obviously, calligraphy maintains its discursive function, but it's calligraphy, it's Kufic, so we have all the time activated more or less strongly this dhikr function on objects of daily life that were used as furniture in domestic architecture. Even in on objects that were used as furniture or as luxury objects, luxury commodities, you found this Kufic calligraphy that, again, is telling you, well, yes, this is an ordinary object, a commodity. We are dealing with daily life. We are not dealing with an environment which is necessarily spiritual, but Kufic recalls the viewer, the beholder, the user of this object, that Kufic calligraphy is a sacred gesture, dhikr again. Clothes, carpets, textiles, ivories that are completely secular. No, they are not completely secular. Kufic is always there to recall logocentrism in Islam as a metaphysical expression. Kufic here, very difficult to read on this textile. It's a Kufic Kufic writing. Kufic writing on this Turkish Seljuk textile. Again, very difficult to read because a lot of experts try to decipher the discourse, and it's impossible, quasi impossible. You can read a little piece of word here and there, but it's very difficult to read the entire calligraphy. And here the design is entirely made out of calligraphy, even the central medallions. And then we have these extraordinary objects that really shows in the purest way how Kufic calligraphy blurs this line between the spiritual and the ordinary and the extraordinary, with these famous ceramics that were produced in the 10th and 11th century during the Samanid, the history of the Samanid dynasty in Central Asia with capital Bukhara. This was an Iranian dynasty, highly cultured dynasty that sponsored the arts. What is very interesting with these objects, first of all, I will show you a sample of them. They are very famous because of their appeal, even to people who have no clue about Islamic art. They are always very astounded by these objects. Others here of these Samanid wares. You see a sample. They can also mix ornaments and calligraphy, or they can even turn calligraphy into figurative topics like these birds. But let's go back to the purest form, like this one. And with this example, you can see that something is told on these wares. For example, here it was translated, generosity is the disposition of the dwellers of paradise. So what is the message? You have a lot of sayings and proverbs, never directly Quranic phrases or sentences or excerpts on these objects. These were very ordinary objects made out of clay, also in material terms, very ordinary objects, not the best, technically speaking, the best objects, not the luxury ceramics that, for example, were produced in the same time at the Abbasid court in Baghdad. That was the center of the caliphate at this time. The Samanids were a dynasty forming an emirate that was part of the Abbasid Caliphate in this time. So these ceramics produced at the Samanid court are not luxury commodities in terms of material value, but they were the most beautiful in aesthetic terms. A lot of care placed in the Kufic calligraphic practice. And then when you observe these objects, the way calligraphy is practiced in taking into account the form of the objects and the care on the calligraphy itself that definitely takes the object, which is a volume, it's a plate with a certain relief. It's like a sculpture, but very minimalist. It's an object that we hold that is used also to eat or to contain something. But the object is still aesthetically apprehended as if it's a scriptural space, as if it's a page. So the calligraphy literally transformed the object into an aesthetic space that is very close to the scriptural space of a folio, of a page, of a book. So that this calligraphy decoration of these very ordinary wares made out of clay, suddenly with this extraordinary art, transform these objects, make these objects as precious, as almost as spiritual as books folios. So you have a conflation here of genre, and these wares that are so ordinary if you consider the medium become aesthetic spaces that are transfigurations. I call these objects transfigurations. And because of the calligraphy, they bring the ordinary close to the extraordinary. And calligraphy here determine a spiritual dimension in this art of pottery, because it's really plain pottery. Even though we don't have Quranic discourse, we have sayings, proverbs, it's kind of popular literature, those transfigured objects cannot be considered only utilitarian, pretty pottery objects. They display definitely a spiritual dimension, because the Kufic script here again function as dhikr. And sometimes it's literally true. The rounded shape is eliminated, or the calligrapher is writing on the object as if it's a page. So he's using the horizontal line to place the word and doesn't take into account the rounded shape. And sometimes here, like here, the sentence can virtually continue beyond the physical rim of the object. So the calligraphy literally transfigures the medium here into something else, which is no longer aware, no longer a plate or bowl. And still you can read, he who seeks the universe while death seeks him. So stories, sayings, again, dhikr, but dhikr here function at the level of popular knowledge. But through the popular knowledge, through this process of transfiguring the ware into something that is very close to book art, the dhikr continues its activity beyond being a dhikr of popular knowledge. It continues the process of intertextuality to recall Quranic copying. So, my conclusion, I will conclude here about calligraphy in Islamic art, is that in this medieval period, we have some principles that are already posited here, is that calligraphy, being a form of discourse that is also taking into account the phenomenal world, is here establishing an art form that is the metaphysical mirror of Islam as a logocentric culture and as a logocentric religion. So that when we look at an artistic object in Islam, and you find, I don't even know any object in traditional artistic production that doesn't have somehow, somewhere, a calligraphic motif that functions there as a zikr. Now you have different intensities of this process of activation of the dhikr, depending on the objects. For example, in those wares from the Samanid court, the dhikr is very intensively activated. But in some objects, it can be not that intensely activated, but it is always there. So calligraphy is, we can think about it as a metaphysical mirror, like Christian imagery is the metaphysical mirror of Christianity in the world of arts and forms and the sensible world. And this brings me to conclude that we cannot say that calligraphy functions as a compensation to the lack of images, because it's not relevant. Calligraphy reflects completely logically the logocentrism of Islam as a faith and a culture. It's an internal logical development here that we are dealing with. So you may hear or read here and there that calligraphy is a compensation of the lack of figuration. No, in Islam there is no lack of figuration at all. It's just that figuration doesn't function in the same way as in other cultural contexts, like in Christianity, because in Christianity logos is incarnated in the body of blood and flesh of Jesus. So calligraphy is by no means the replacement in Islam of figuration. It's a logical outcome of Islamic metaphysics. And it has to be understood in this way. And it dominates the visual landscape because it's the most relevant spiritual form of expression. But it doesn't mean that figuration is prohibited per se. Figuration developed in tremendous way and with outstanding paintings in book art. But in a specific way. But here we are dealing with something, with an art form that is the ultimate artistic expression in Islam as logocentric faith and culture and visuality. Thank you.